Good evening. You know, with Alabama's football struggles this year, I was going to be quieter about, talking. But when we sing about it, anybody else notice that? Crimson Tide in the song? I know Carrie noticed. I had to bring it up, guys. It was Wesley's fault. It wasn't my fault. Tonight we're going to pick up with our study from last week. Just really quickly to remind us all of what we talked about. We've started with us. We started with our culture. And we talked about how our culture is really guilt-based in a lot of ways. We run on a guilt and innocence paradigm where we're motivated to do things by an inner sense, or at least we're expected to be motivated by an inner sense of conscience. We're supposed to be convicted by our conscience. That's part of growing up in our culture. And that's because our culture is very individualistic. We're focused on the individual. And this is just kind of a side note, but this week I encountered this creed here from the middle school across the street. And I thought it was a really good example of the individualism of our culture. And I'm not criticizing this. It's just an example of how we are focused on the individual in our culture. So it says, and they recite this every morning to begin the day. They say, I am a motivated and dedicated Naperville Middle School student. I'm responsible for my own actions. I am prepared for my day of learning, and I have all the tools that I need. If you haven't noticed, the word I is popping up a lot in here, so keep a lookout for that. I will respect myself and others. If my mind can perceive it, my heart can believe it, then my hands can achieve it. I will make today the very best day of all, for this day begins the rest of my life. This is my time, my school, and my place to succeed. I have the power to accept the challenges that each day brings. I have great expectations for myself. So like I said, I'm not criticizing this. Seems like a pretty good creed overall, something to say at the beginning of the day. It's just an example of we are very much focused on the individual in our culture. I, my, me. We're focused on our personal self-development. The phrase self-esteem would sound incredibly strange to someone who's from one of these cultures on this side of the ledger, because self-esteem is not on their radar. Your self-worth comes from the community's assessment of you. It's not anything from the inside of you. Like we said last week, this is almost hard to compute because it's so different. But when they do something wrong, if nobody knows about it, there's no guilt inside, not even deep down from what I've read, from what I've heard. Just very different because they're very much a communal-based type of culture, and we are very much individual-based. Now, the main reason we're talking about this is because the first century Mediterranean world was very much honor and shame based. They worked on an honor-shame paradigm. And if you know anything about the context of the New Testament, that was that culture, the first century Mediterranean world, Roman world. But we actually have a modern-day example. We talked last week about several modern-day examples from especially Eastern countries in our world. But after the sermon last week, Dr. Dale came up and he told me this story about from when he was serving overseas, and he encountered something that was really along the lines of what we had talked about. So I've asked him to come up, and it's just going to be a quick little story, but he's just going to tell it to us real quick, and then just to illustrate this, and we'll move on.
When I was in Vietnam, my assignment was to work in a civilian hospital, in the provincial hospital, a little rural community called Kamau. So with 18 corpsmen, we basically staffed what would amount to a county hospital. I was prepared as I could be for the medical aspect of things. I could talk to you about worms and parasites, but I was not prepared for the Oriental mindset. I knew that basically the religion in this community was going to be predominantly Buddhist with some Catholics, but I did not know how the Oriental mind thought. I had a translator for the first 4 months that I was there. And during that period of time, I was called to the hospital to see a Viet Cong guerrilla that had been captured the night before in an ambush and he'd been shot in the belly. He was on a hospital bed, which consisted of a metal frame with peeling paint, what we would call 1x4s across it, and a grass mat. He had on a pair of shorts. He was very muscular, very trim, very fit-looking young man that I would guess to be probably in his mid to early 20s. He was restrained with ropes tied around each ankle into the foot of the bed and around each wrist and to the top of the bed. When I walked in to see him, and this was in an open ward with about 8 other beds there, the look on his face was one of disgust or hatred, anger, kind of a snarl. And it was clearly evident that he'd been shot in the abdomen. But when I reached down to touch his abdomen, he rose up and tried to bite me. My translator was with me, and I stepped back and said, "What is this?" He said, "He does not want you to touch him." And my translator talked with him a few minutes. Clearly, there was bowel content running out through this bullet hole, and the man needed to be explored, washed out, dealt with properly, surgically. And my translator got me outside the room and said he does not want to be operated on. To be operated on by an American would dishonor him and probably dishonor his family in the community. Well, the end result of that was he was a captive. He was a possession of the South Vietnamese army, and I did what needed to be done with the young man and got him fixed up, and he left the hospital in the possession of the South Vietnamese soldiers about a week later. What happened after that, I have no knowledge of. But I just thought that's striking, that a young man in enough pain with a leaking abdominal wound to try to bite someone trying to help him, because to help him could bring dishonor to him and to his family, is an entirely different mindset from what you and I deal with.
I told Dr. Dale he could say that better than I could, so I appreciate him coming up and telling that story. But that was just so striking to me, and almost kind of backed up some of what we talked about last week, where it really is an entirely different mindset that someone in these cultures possesses. Because honor and shame matter so much. That's why there are thousands of honor killings every year, because they take this as a life and death matter. So tonight, what we're going to do is build on the us and them and talk about how maybe some of how our worldview, our guilt and innocence worldview, has impacted how we think about Jesus, how we think about specifically the gospel. That's the it in the middle here. And how maybe also trying to get into the mind of an honor and shame culture can help us understand the gospel even just that much better. So tonight, we have 3 ideas that we're going to focus on under this umbrella of the gospel. The first one is duality. And this essentially is just the idea that we don't want to abandon our guilt-innocence paradigm for looking at the gospel, because it's legitimate. But also, we don't want to miss the honor and shame paradigm that naturally, in our culture, we're not going to see. So I think unless we're very intentional to escape from our Western worldview when we read the Bible, it's necessarily going to influence how we see the cross. Let me give you an example. I think a lot of the time, we tend to think of the cross and what happened on it as something like this. I sinned, therefore, there's something on my record, and it needs to be cleared by God, before God, right? I think that's the main way we tend to think about the gospel. It's a personal, individual. You see that here, right? It's very Western, you probably can tell, because it's focused on us. I have sinned. I am guilty. That guilt needs to be wiped away. And all of that's legitimate. All of that is true. Jesus died partially to wash away my personal, individual sins, right? All of that is absolutely right. So it's not wrong, but to me, it's kind of like eating grilled chicken. So grilled chicken is great for you, right? Grilled chicken is like one of the best things you can eat. I eat it all the time. But if you only eat grilled chicken, which is kind of me, if you only eat grilled chicken, then even though grilled chicken is great for you, you're going to be malnourished, right? Because you need nourishments that grilled chicken doesn't give to you. I think this is kind of like that, where this view, this legal view of the cross is great and we need it. We have to have it. Jesus absolutely took our guilt away on the cross. But if that's the only thing we think about the cross, then we're missing some very key elements that might help us appreciate what Jesus did even more. So, this is important because the cross is the fundamental place where our new identity is formed. Both individually, your new identity and mine, but also collectively. As Christians, we are a new creature, right? So we have a new identity. And the cross is the fundamental place where that comes from. You can see this in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, where Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, it's Christ who lives in me. In other words, Paul had a new identity. Jesus was inside of him, right? The cross is where that started for Paul. So this is why this is so important, because this one event is at the foundation of so much of who we are as Christians, both individually and collectively. So what we want to understand is that the cross is certainly not less than a judicial act, but it's also much more than only a judicial act. As sinners, we were absolutely guilty before God. Our consciences needed to be convicted, and they still need to be. But there's more. We have all robbed God of His honor through our sin. It's not just that we took guilt on ourselves. It's that we have robbed God of His honor. At its root, that's really what sin is. It's any act that robs God of the honor that is due to Him. In Romans 3 verse 23, it tells us, notice how these concepts are linked. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Remember last week how we said that honor is one way that we might understand the concept of glory? Because it's kind of not really familiar to us in our culture. But we do understand honor. So think of honor when you see the word glory. We fall short of the honor of God. We haven't reached that level. In fact, we disgrace Him through our sin. That means that our problem is more than only an objective legal reality. It's also personal and relational. It's all about when I sin, I personally rob God of the honor that He deserves from me. This is a personal thing between me and God. It's not just judicial. And if for us it's only about the judicial guilt, this is the danger that we run into. If it's only about that, then it becomes very safe for us. It feels very safe. Because if I think of it in legal terms, then I know, according to a law, I just need to do this and not do this, and I'll be okay, right? I just need not to go 25 miles over the speed limit, and I'm not going to get pulled over, right? It's very safe because I'm assured. And there's a part of that that's absolutely legitimate. But also, that type of legalism misses the point of much of the gospel. It's not only about do this, don't do this, and God has to save you, or God cannot send you to hell forever. There might be a legitimate aspect in that somewhere, but that's not all that it's about. That misses the fact that our very real legal transgression has brought shame on us, individually and corporately as humans, and it's separated us from God. And that's the second thought that I want us to focus on, is just humanity as a whole. This is more than just about you and me. It's more than just my sin. It's more than just your sin. This is a bigger picture that's involved. So because our society is so focused on the individual, we tend to be uncomfortable with any notion that someone else's sin might have consequences for me, right? Because I didn't do that. Why would I have to pay for that? That's not my fault. And certainly there's truth in that. Like, you don't have to pay. You're not guilty for anyone else's sin. But also, we all face consequences for everybody's sin. That's at least the picture that the Bible paints of this. Look at Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 19 here. These are just selections from this text. And if you read through it, you'll see the same thing, but just to highlight these. Paul says, sin came into the world through one man. So there's the one. And death through sin. And so death spread to all men because all have sinned. Then he says, many died through one man's trespass. And he says, because of one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man. And then, one trespass led to condemnation for all men. And then last for us from this passage, by the one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners. Now, obviously, we were chopping a lot out of that. We were chopping the good parts out of that, where Jesus atoned for us. But I wanted us to see our individualism. If you're like me, you're uncomfortable reading those texts, those phrases. But I want to suggest to you that for me, and maybe for you, that discomfort that I feel in reading about how somebody else's sin thousands of years ago could impact me today. I want to suggest to you that the discomfort that we feel at that is because of our culture. It's because of the individualism that our culture emphasizes so highly, prioritizes above almost everything else. It's giving us a lens through which we look at the gospel. So think about it in their context. Given what we've talked about how honor and shame cultures are very much more communal than individualistic. Let's think about it through their lens. For them, being a sinner means that we are embedded within a group of people who've messed up. It's not only our individual sin. Primarily, it's that as a human race, we stand ashamed before God. Because as a race, we have dishonored Him. We have shamed Him from the honor that He deserves. So we are individually guilty before Him. But we also have corporately dishonored Him. We're all in this together. As a human race, we've dishonored our Creator, our Lord, our greatest lover, our friend. We dishonored Him. This is, the World Cup is going on right now. If you follow sports or the news at all, you'll know that it's happening right now. And England just got eliminated this past week from the World Cup. But if you reverse in time, about 56 years to 1966, England actually won the World Cup. And Bobby Moore is the guy you see on the screen here right in the middle. He was the team's captain that year. And what you see is him going to shake the Queen's hand and receive the trophy for winning the World Cup. What you can't see in this picture is that Bobby Moore was absolutely terrified on the inside. I mean, he was just shaking, which, I think we all would be if we're meeting the Queen, right? But he's actually not terrified mainly because of that. That's what I would be scared of. But for him, he said that the reason he was scared when he was meeting the Queen here is because as he's walking up the steps to meet her, receive the trophy, he noticed that his hands were covered in dirt. Like the match had just ended. And they had just won. And his hands were covered in dirt from the match. You can see from his shorts. You can imagine how dirty his hands were, right? So he's terrified as he's going up here because he sees the Queen's gloves. Those are white gloves that are just absolutely spotless. And he knows he's going to have to shake her hand. So he's just frantically trying to clean his hands off as he's going up the steps. And I think this illustrates for us how we tend to think of coming before God, for lack of a better term. I think we tend to think that our sin must be clean before we can get to God. I must repent and confess so God will forgive me, and then I can have a relationship with Him. And like I've been trying to say the whole time, that's true, that's legitimate. But that's not the only thing that's going on here. This is almost as if the entire England team had actually lost the game. Not only had they lost the game, but they had done something incredibly shameful during the game. Let's say the whole team someone on the other team had fallen down. The whole team just charged on him and all kicked him at once. So it's something just completely shameful that is shameful for the country, right? They're representing their country. And then, after losing the game, making this shameful act in front of the whole world, then they have to go up together and meet the Queen. It's almost like that. They come to her not as winners, but as these dirty, shamed losers. I think that illustrates the difference here. It's not just that we're coming to God as winners with dirty hands ourselves. It's that all together We have shamed our King. We've done something that's embarrassing for him. We've robbed him of his honor. Now, thankfully, our story doesn't end there, right? And that's our third thought for tonight, is along those lines. But I don't want to underestimate how serious the shame is that we've brought on ourselves and that we've brought on God by how we've acted corporately, but also individually. Now, our last thought for tonight is publicity. And in many ways, what's interesting to me is that you'll see, now that we've talked about this and you have this concept, for me, as I'm reading through the Gospels this week, I was seeing how you really can understand all of Jesus' ministry through the lens of honor and shame. Think about all the times that the Pharisees come to Jesus in public and they're trying to test him, right? They ask him a question. They're trying to get him to trip up in front of everybody. What's interesting is that in those cultures, you don't ask questions in public for information. If you want to actually learn something from someone, you go to them privately because it's embarrassing to ask someone in public. Remember, shame is a huge deal for them. It's shameful to ask someone in public for information. This is why Nicodemus came to Jesus privately. This is why his disciples frequently came to Jesus privately after everyone else had left. Because that's where you go to get information. You ask not in front of everybody. But when you ask a question in public, that is a contest. That is a match in what some people call the honor game in these cultures. We call it a game, but it's an incredibly serious game. And every time that two sides meet, this happens daily in bigger and smaller ways, but every time that two sides meet, the audience determines who the winner is, who walks away with more honor, and who has lost some honor in this interchange. And if you know anything about Jesus' interaction with these Pharisees, you know that it doesn't normally go well for them, right? And one example of this is in Matthew 22 in verse 46, where the Pharisees have been asking questions, they've been trying to test him, and eventually they just give up. Matthew says that no one was able to answer Jesus a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. So in this verse, Jesus has struck the knockout blow. He's won. It's over. So he had to die. That seems like a jump, right? On the one hand, you have this honor game, and then all of a sudden, Jesus is being crucified. How does that work? Well, remember how important this is for them. Remember how honor and shame can only be, or the shame can only be justified through the shedding of blood in these cultures. So Jesus had to pay. But it wasn't just enough that he had to die. That wasn't enough for them. Because think about it. They didn't just hire some assassin to take him out in a dark alley. They could have done that. But that would have made him a martyr, which would have done the exact opposite of what they needed. They needed him to die publicly. They needed him humiliated, shamed, disgraced. They needed him executed as a criminal. And so, we know what happens next. He's crucified on a cross publicly. They take him to the most shameful and public place imaginable. And I want to read with you these three verses from Matthew's account that just illustrate in a very small space just a few of the shameful things that Jesus endured in this encounter. It says that just notice, every phrase here is incredibly embarrassing. They stripped him. They put a scarlet robe on him. And notice this is mocking his claim to be a king. They put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. Notice, every single phrase in those three verses is humiliating for anybody, but especially for God himself, who comes in the flesh and endures that to save the people who were doing it to him. And that's part of the wonder of the cross, that Jesus endured that shame. That's what we have in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2. It says that for the joy that was set before him, Jesus endured the cross. Well, what's that next phrase? And you'll never be able to unsee it now. Despising the shame. Now, we understand shame to some extent. Nobody wants to be embarrassed. This is why, this might be an admission on my part, but for me, I'm terrified. I always check to make sure I have the Lord's Supper when I walk in here, because I'm terrified to raise my hand in front of everybody and admit that I did not get the Lord's Supper on the way in. Anybody else like that? That just me? Okay, Fine. I'm embarrassing myself. All right. So we understand shame to some extent, right? But for them, think about all those stories we talked about last week. Think about what Dr. Dale related to us this week. Shame is what it's all about. Honor is what it's all about. So Jesus goes through the cross despising the shame, not the pain. If you notice when you read through the gospel accounts of his crucifixion, they talk very, very little about the pain that he went through. They just say he was whipped, he was crucified. They don't go into detail like we tend to do, which is when we talk about it, it's good. It's good for us to appreciate, obviously, what he did for us. But if you read through it again, you'll see over and over and over again, they emphasize not the pain, but the shame that he endured on the cross and in the events surrounding it. So in the cross, he bore our shame as well as our guilt. If he just died in an alley, he could have taken care of our guilt. No problem. He's the perfect sacrifice. Our guilt's gone. But our shame remains. He had to be executed publicly. The blood had to be spilt publicly to cover for us. In 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21, read it through these lenses. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin. He knew no sin, not only guilt, but no shame. But then he endured the shame that we deserve, individually and collectively, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And so he dies. He's disgraced. His enemies won. At least they think they did. But that's not the end of the story. We know what happens next. We know he gets up from the grave and all of that. That's the most important event in history. But behind the curtain from all of that, there's something more abstract going on that's almost as important as the resurrection itself. Paul gives us a peek behind that curtain in Colossians 2 in verse 15. He tells us that, speaking of the cross, he says that Jesus disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. He put them to an open shame. He took the spiritual realities behind his physical enemies and he shamed them in front of the whole world, for the whole world to see. God picked him up from the grave. And when he did that, he vindicated him in front of the whole world. He said, look, this man that all of you just shamed over and over and over again publicly in the worst way imaginable, he's my son. And where's Jesus now? He's not in that shameful place. Instead, he's been raised to God's right hand, the place of the most honor imaginable. And not only is he sitting right there beside God, but also Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 9 tells us that he is now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. So there he is. He's way up there at God's right hand. And even though his forehead is scarred with that crown of thorns, now he has a new crown. A crown of glory and honor. And that happened, Philippians 2 tells us, because he went through the shame. He was shamed for us, so God honors him forever. And the thing that we learn from Philippians 2 and from so many other texts is that if we are willing to admit that we are shameful, that we have brought shame on our Creator, if we're willing to admit that we are down here, and not only that, but if we're willing to endure shame here on earth for his sake, that God will highly exalt us as well. For our sake, he was brought low, so that we with him might be brought high. So now, the only glory remaining for us in this world is our shame. Think about what Paul says in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 19. He says that the enemies of the cross glory in their shame. You know how Jesus, over and over and over again, I just realized I missed a text here, but in Matthew 20 and verse 16, Jesus says that the first will be last, the last will be first, right? So over and over and over again, Jesus puts this great reversal into motion. He promises the last will be first, the first will be last. That makes no sense. But here Jesus is promising it. And for us, we hear that. And if it's just this random guy in first century Palestine talking about it, then we can dismiss it. But because God got him up from the grave, because he's honored him above everybody else, now we have to listen to it. We have to say, wait, maybe this great reversal really has happened. And now, the gospel that should be shameful. Paul can say in Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of this gospel. It should be shameful. Your leader died. He was humiliated in front of the entire world. But Paul's not ashamed because he knows what's in store. He knows in Philippians 1:20, he says, it's my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. That's what we want. We have this message that's scandalous, it's shameful, until it's not. Because Jesus takes things and he changes them forever. He turns them on their head. He's done that with reality itself. And he can also do that for your life and for mine. He can also do that for our church. He can take the bad parts of our reality, turn them on their heads, and bring honor to himself, to his Father, through even our shameful acts. Will you join me this week in saying that whether by life or by death, no matter what, I just want to bring honor to Jesus. Whatever I do in my body, I want to sacrifice it to God, to bring honor to him, to worship him. Let's go out this week and do it together. And if you have something you need to make right tonight publicly, why don't you do that?